an issue that is so important for the development of higher education around the world. Family-owned or managed universities. Quite an intriguing phenomenon. When I talked about it to colleagues, and especially also about the book that you've just edited, Phil Altbach, Hans de Wit, Edward Choi, and Matthew Allen, a book really very interesting to read as well on this phenomenon, with papers from many different places and on many faces of family-owned universities. I really look forward to this wonderful discussion here. In discussing it just a few minutes ago with a colleague of mine, Andreas Corcoran, the Deputy Secretary General of the International Association of Universities, he said, I will watch this webinar more specifically so. He is a historian of higher education and its development. And he said, we'd be very, very curious to see what the difference is today between a family-owned or managed university and these universities in the 16th and 17th century that were actually family managed already, because that was the only way that universities could progress at that time. So Andreas, if you're among the participants, watch this session with care, and all the others as well, because it will be interesting to indeed debate a phenomenon that was once very popular, not in the positive sense of the word, but the way to go about the development of higher education in the 16th and 17th century, and a phenomenon very important today for the development as well of higher education. So thank you, all the authors and editors of that book, and for this joint webinar today, and really looking forward to the discussion and the presentation of what this area of higher education actually means, where it leads, and where it will be in the years to come. So thank you, and let's enjoy this webinar together. Gerardo.
Thank you very much. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to this event. And I think I wanted to start by just saying that this webinar truly represents the best about the Center for International Higher Education. And what I mean by that is our partnership with the International Association of Universities, our truly global network of researchers, our commitment to collaboration, but also our interest in elevating and sharing the voices that are often not represented in some of these global academic spaces. And I really think both the book and this webinar represent the best of these commitments. I also wanted to highlight how often, whether we call them family-owned or family-managed universities, I wanted to highlight how these, in many spaces, are just universities, right? In many spaces around the world, this is what many of the enrollments in higher education have access to. And I also think that represents the approach that we follow in the Center for International Higher Education, making that familiar, unfamiliar, so that we can render it ready for analysis. So I'm really excited to listen to all of our presenters and welcome once again, and thank you to the International Association of Universities for partnering with us to offer this event. Welcome everyone. And now it is my pleasure to truly introduce the introduction of our event. Hans, back to you.
Thank you, and thank you both Hilge and Gerardo for doing this. We will have two parts of this webinar. The first one will be by my fellow co-authors, Philip Albach, Edward Choi, and Matt Allen, who will present much more the history of this project and the main trends and issues that we have been working on. There will be a possibility then to ask some questions. So if you have questions to the three presenters in the first part, please put them in the chat room. And then we will then follow up with the second part, which my colleague from IAU, Joshua Marione, will be moderating, which will be case studies from India, Symbiosis, International University, from Armenia, the Eurasian International University, from Korea, much more a national case study by Edward Choi, and from Ethiopia by what was Tamra. So we thought it would be good to give those case studies because it is really a new phenomenon, and making it much more clear how that applies to different contexts is very important as well. We could have done many other case studies which are in the book and outside of the book, including, for instance, from Latin America, where there are a lot of family-owned and managed universities, but we had some time limitations to cover. So with that, I give the floor to Philip Albach, who will tell you how he came to this idea and addressing this whole project and his conceptual focus. Phil, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Welcome to the webinar. You have chosen to participate in what I think is one of the most important webinars on an extremely key, but almost unresearched and unthought about topic in all of higher education. And that is twofold. One is private higher education in general, which really is under-researched and in many ways underappreciated and also under-criticized. So there's much work to be done. We have our colleagues at the State University of New York and Albany under the leadership of Professor Dan Levy, who's done fantastic work on private higher education around the world in general. But this is a topic which, although it's been around even since the Middle Ages, and particularly important in the current period, is really, really under-researched. The particular aspect that we're focused on, which is family-owned managed institutions, is of tremendous importance
हाँ मैं वो ढूंढ रही थी बेल्ट जिसमें डाल दूं बट वो मिला नहीं
and completely under-researched. Indeed, our project is absolutely the first research ever done on this topic, and we hope it will not be the last, because family-owned and managed institutions are very common all around the world. We first, at the Center for International Higher Education, got started on private higher education more than 2 decades ago and published a book in 1999 called Private Prometheus about private higher education. One of the first, maybe the first, global book on this topic. How did we get interested in family-owned? It's a funny story. And dates back maybe a decade to a couple of students who came to our center to do their master's and PhDs, one of whom was now Dr. Edward Choi, who comes from a family who has a university. And we've had several others from Japan, another from Korea, also. And so I started scratching my head and saying, what's going on here? These are young people, very bright, who are interested in many ways in going into the family business. And what is this family business? Why did they start? And I started talking to our students and then thinking about this topic, and it grew from there. And thus the book, which has been mentioned, and our broader interest in the topic. So this is a very important key aspect. As we all know, half the enrollments now in Latin America are in private higher education. In some East Asian countries, Korea, Japan, Taiwan, half, more than 80%, or about 80% of enrollments are in private higher education, and we don't know the number of family-owned that are part of that big number. But this, ladies and gentlemen, is a key topic. So let me turn it over to our experts to sort of provide a context and then some really interesting case studies. Thanks.
Thank you, Phil, for explaining this context, how we came to this project. And now I give the vote to Edward Choi, who Phil already mentioned. He is a PhD graduate from Center for International Higher Education, now back in Korea, teaching at Yonsei University and also being a part of the board of the university of his family. So Edward, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hans and Phil. To continue the discussion, we are convinced that FAMIs are a special breed of institutions. On the one hand, they are organizations typifying the characteristics finding an academic enterprise. And on the other hand, they are organizations owned and operated by what the family firm literature refers to as the dominant family coalition, dominant family coalitions. Families possessing significant influence in directing organizational affairs over successive generations. As an academic enterprise, FAMIs resemble non-family types in terms of many characteristics, for example, mission and purpose. Some FAMIs are profit-oriented, while other FAMIs have a non-profit mission. In terms of institutional size, some FAMIs are smaller, enrolling hundreds of students, and other FAMIs are quite massive, are quite big, enrolling tens of thousands of students. In terms of academic offerings, some FAMIs are comprehensive institutions offering a broad array of programming and majors, while other FAMIs are more vocationally oriented, so offering programs with market relevance. Now, it is our understanding, according to our preliminary research, that most FAMIs globally have this market orientation, this vocational orientation, and it is also our understanding that that most FAMIs globally do not focus on research. Now, there are exceptions to this observation in countries such as Korea, India, Japan, and perhaps others. There are FAMIs of high repute, and they are recognized for their research orientation. In terms of funding patterns as well, FAMIs as a private institution mostly rely on tuition revenue. One difference between FAMIs and non-family private types has to do with the investments made by the founder and the family members of the founder. Significant investments are made when the family establishes the institution, as well as significant investments are made over the lifespan of these family members as well. In terms of government oversight, FAMIs are invariably part of the higher education systems in which they operate. Thus, they are generally subject to the same rules and regulations as non-family types, especially counterparts in the private sector, non-family counterparts in the private sector. Now, in addition to having all the characteristics that I just described, the prototypical higher education characteristics, FAMIs have another set of characteristics. And these characteristics set them apart from non-family institutions. These characteristics constitute what's referred to as the Familiiness Dimension of organizations. This Familiiness Dimension may be broken into distinct components called Socio-Emotional Wealth. Socio-Emotional Wealth are understood as the non-financial endowments in a family-run organization created through the managerial involvement of the dominant family coalition. So one socio-emotional wealth is family influence. The family comes to occupy a dominant position within the decision-making chain and hierarchy. And typically it's the case that family members occupy multiple leadership positions within the same organization. Positions in the board, position as president, vice president, positions, leadership positions at the departmental level, so on and so forth. Identity is the second socio-emotional wealth, referring to the family sharing an identity with the organizations they run. The performance of the organization reflects either negatively, poorly, or positively on the family and vice versa. Second socio-emotional wealth is binding social ties, otherwise known as relational capital. The family is understood to proactively cultivate this form of capital, and typically you'll find an abundance of relationships rooted in trust and reciprocity and understanding and loyalty at family-run organizations. And the fourth, socio-emotional wealth, is emotional attachment, referring to the emotional bonds that families members share with other family members. These attachments are dynamic and can be positive in the form of pride. They can also be negative in the forms of frustration or anger. Whatever they are, the family firm literature understands them as spilling over into the business affairs of the organization. So negative emotional attachments may disrupt business processes and have an adverse effect on performance and vice versa. And finally, we have renewal, referring to the renewal of the family's vision, interests, and values through the succession mechanism. So this socio-emotional wealth refers to family-based succession. The existence of socio-emotional wealth and its intersection with the prototypical higher education characteristics that I described earlier creates all sorts of challenges and opportunities, barriers that are unique to the family population. And these challenges and opportunities, I believe, will be discussed in the individual cases and perhaps by our next speaker, Dr. Matthew Allen.
Thank you, Edward. And now the floor to Matt Allen, which is from Babson College. And we asked him to join us because we know much that there are family businesses, so the family-owned and managed universities are both an academic institution and a business. And so to get also that family business perspective in, we were grateful to have Matthew Allen join us in this project. And so he will focus on that aspect. Well, thank you very much. The floor is yours, Matt.
Hans, thank you, and Edward as well. It's a pleasure for me to be here with you today. I'm so grateful to be a part of this project. As Hans mentioned, this is not my area of research. I come from a business school and my background is on the business side, but this journey has been a fascinating one for me, learning a little bit about this area of family business that I was not aware of, at least not aware of it in the sense that we're now becoming more aware of how significant these businesses are in the world. So today what I wanted to do was just talk a little bit about this phenomena from my perspective, from a research perspective. And I wanted to share some questions that the book raised for me and for my area of research, which is outside of higher education, but I still think has some interesting connections to research being done in higher education. So I have some slides that I prepared. I'm just going to share them because I want to make sure that I get these points correct as I talk about them. As I mentioned, I'm on the family business side. And so if you think about the research that I do, most of what I'm focused on is either the business or the family. And when it's the business, it's about profitability, strategic decision-making, and especially structure, because in family business, the question is really about how does the business interact with the family? And then from the family perspective, it's all about intention, needs, purpose, and again, structure inside the family. And so to take family business and look at a specific industry or a specific area of operation is not a typical approach in the family business literature. And what's fascinating to me is as you look at the book and especially the cases, and I'm so excited to hear more from our case writers because there's so much depth and breadth of understanding that comes from these cases. There were some interesting research questions that were raised for me in my field. And so I just want to go through 5 of those research questions and talk very briefly about each of them and give you some insight into why this is an interesting topic, not just from a higher education perspective, but also from a business and a family business perspective. A lot of this overlaps with what Edward mentioned as well. So I'm grateful that he paved the way before me and set up some of my arguments. So number 1, really interesting question is about the motivation behind the family and their decisions to engage in education as a business opportunity. We know that families in general are very interested in education, and one of the primary purposes of the family is to prepare the next generation, whether it be business or not business, for what's coming in the future. And so families engage in education, but why then would families choose higher education as opposed to other industries or sectors that they might pursue a business? And this idea of socio-emotional wealth potentially explains that. Being involved in higher education has the potential to raise your position in the community, to garner some respect from those that are around you, and to build what Edward referred to as socio-emotional wealth. And we don't know exactly why families choose this area, if they happen into it, if they do it by choice. Some of the cases would move us one direction or another, but it's a very interesting question to be pursued from a family business perspective. Number two, and this might be more interesting to me, this idea of what I refer to as credentialed succession. So obviously one of the differences in a family-owned business compared to other businesses is succession and the desire to pass the business from one generation on to the next. In most cases, when you're dealing with family businesses, the preparation of the successor is managed for the most part within the family, meaning the family makes decisions about what kind of experience they'd like the successor to have, where they should go for their education, what types of things they should learn, and how that education or preparation is going to contribute to the business going forward. But in a family-owned or managed university, there is a need for external credentialing. And in most universities, it is the PhD, the doctoral degree, that indicates ability to participate in the family business. And Edward is a perfect example of this, coming to Boston College in order to pursue a credential that is necessary for him to participate in the family business legitimately into the future. We don't have a lot of businesses like this. You might look at a law firm or an accounting firm where you would need to get specific credentials, but those are the minority. And so I think there's some really interesting questions around how families approach this, and especially with the level of investment. This is not a one-year MBA program that these next generation members are participating in. This is a 5 to 6 year degree. The third one is this interplay, and Edward mentioned this as well, between the family, the business, and government. I think in higher education, the role of the government and government oversight plays a significant role in how the family approaches the industry and the decisions that they make. And again, this is more or less unique when you compare this to other family businesses. And I think it's interesting because one of the findings that we are consistently seeing in the family business research is that, especially in developing countries, families and family businesses can play a role similar to the government when the government is not quite as established as it might be, in that a family or a family business could provide some stability in certain areas in developing countries where customers, consumers, suppliers, other people in the network look to the family as a source of stability in place of the government or along with the government. And so lots of interesting questions about families, governments, and businesses, especially in this area of family-owned universities. Number 4, market-related questions and issues related to the family involvement in certain sectors or industries, especially universities. So if you look at the cases in the book, I would say predominantly the cases indicate that families come in and fill market niches in the education sector, higher education. They don't come in and dominate. They find holes that are not being filled by government-run institutions or other private institutions, and then they fill those gaps by creating their institutions. And I think that's an interesting question about why and how families come in and fill these niches, and maybe some questions about the competitive advantage of families. Why might families be more prepared or more organized to fill some of these smaller market niches, especially as it relates to employment needs for the students and filling specific immediate needs? And then that leads to the last one, which is this idea of entrepreneurship, innovation, and family and the business. Being at Babson, where our #1 focus is around this area of entrepreneurship, obviously entrepreneurship and innovation is very interesting to us. And when you look at family-owned and managed universities, again, looking at the market, the role of families in filling gaps, the role of families in looking at a market of higher education, and then recognizing needs, recognizing that customer needs are not being met, whether it's certain geographic needs where there's not a university in this particular location and we think we can fill this need, or whether it's the type of education. Edward mentioned family-owned businesses or family-owned universities don't generally look at research as a primary component of what they're doing, and instead they're looking more at the education side and specifically looking at the needs of the market from an employment perspective and then coming in and filling those needs. So I'm going to stop there, but just want to end by thanking the community for allowing me to come in and be part of this group and to engage in the research conversation. And I hope, if nothing else, I've raised some questions about how studying higher education can actually inform other areas of interest like business and family business. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you also, Phil and Edward, for giving this overview. Please feel free to ask questions still in the chat box. I also included in the chat box a PDF file with a flyer of the book where you can order the book with a discount to our publisher, Brill Sense, and so feel free to do that. There's still not questions, but maybe I can take the privilege of asking my fellow editors questions, and maybe start with Edward. Edward, one element that you have not touched so much upon is that many families that own or manage universities not exclusively are in the higher education business. I think your family also is not only, but also is in primary or secondary education. Can you elaborate a little bit about that?
Yes, typically it's the case that families, they establish multiple institutions tied to a single educational foundation in Korea. And I'll talk more about this when I talk about my case. But this is common. I think from our preliminary research, we found this to be the common case globally, that typically families will establish multiple different types of institutions. Some of these institutions will exist on a single campus, at a single physical plant, and sometimes these institutions are spread geographically. But yes, that is a typical case that we found from our preliminary research.
Okay, thank you.
Hans, if I can add to that, because I think it's a really quite important point, and I'm thinking to one of our cases, and indeed one of the reasons that got me thinking about this idea of family-owned managed universities long ago, maybe even 30 years ago, and that's Tamagawa University in Japan, which is a highly respected kind of mid-level private family founded university, which was founded as a school by I think the great grandfather of the student who studied with us at BC, who had the social mission, back almost 100 years ago, to contribute to education in Japan. The reasons I don't know. And gradually it grew from a school to a high school to a college, then to a university with a variety of graduate programs attached, and quite successfully over time. So that the point that Hans raises is a really key one. Another aspect of this, which is a little bit mentioned in some of the cases, and more broadly understood, is some of these families are interested from a commercial point of view in business opportunities, not only in education, but in property development and other fields like that, which they are able to link with education. So this is true of especially the for-profit higher education sector around the world. But it's a highly complicated set of issues, which are really very important to think about.
Thank you. Related to that, from the Latin American case, for instance, we know, first of all, that many universities start basically as a very small, they call them even universidades de garaje. So you build a classroom in the carriage next to your house because you have some money left and you want to spend that. And then if you are successful, you build the next building to it, and then gradually it becomes a campus. And if you're not successful, you put your money in something else, which can be a football club or a soccer club or culture or whatever. But so that's an element that also is quite common that you will see. There is an interesting question first from Ghulam Mohammed Bai. Say, are all family-owned universities family managed, or are there cases of family-owned institutions that are not family managed? Who would can respond to that? Edward, you have been addressing that issue as well, I think, in your research.
Yes, just 1 second. Let me just read the question again. Are all family-owned universities family managed? To answer that question, I guess it depends on how we define managed. Sometimes the family steers the university remotely. Other times the families are more directly involved. In either case, if we understand managed to be representing either of those cases, then yes, then all family-owned universities are family managed. Or are there cases of family-owned institutions that are not family managed? It's our understanding that the family remains to have a somewhat of a dominant influence in steering the strategic affairs of the university or college.
Yeah, but on the other hand, in some national contexts, and I think Korea may be one, there are legal requirements relating to who can be on boards of trustees and boards of directors, which may limit the family's quote power, unquote, in how the place is managed. And sometimes this, I know from just a few examples, not in our case studies, where this has caused great problems, conflicts between government and families. So like for most other things, it's complicated. Universities, unlike some other industries, as you pointed out, Edward, are often, and I think Matt also pointed out, in some countries, highly regulated industries. And there is a recognition sometimes by government that some families may not have the kind of leadership that the government thinks they ought to have.
Right.
Okay. We have some other questions before we move to the second part. Question by Isabel Valdes. What is the major finding regarding the academic quality of the universities families owned? Do you find a difference in quality regarding other universities? Can some of you say something about that?
It's our understanding that most family-owned or managed institutions globally are of lower tier. So most of them are of lower quality. Now, there are exceptions out there. As I mentioned before, in several countries such as India, Korea, and Japan, and perhaps others, there are family-owned institutions of higher quality, institutions that fall, that are situated within the top 10 ranking.
Yeah, just to add to that briefly, most of private higher education is, as the economists say, demand absorbing, and very few countries have private universities which are at the top of the ranks. The United States being the most distinguished example there, but there are some other countries too. It's just what Edward had to say, that there are some which are very good and many which are average or below, I think we can say. But again, this is subject to research. We need to know more about this.
Yeah. Then the next question, does it make a big difference whether the institutions are for-profit or not for-profit? Is there any cases? We will certainly hear from the cases that we have been having in the second part about their status, etc. Most of the family-owned universities are for-profit, but there are cases where they can officially not be countries, allowing them to be for-profit, and then the non-for-profit. And what we have seen, for instance, then is that there are other ways how you make your profit. For instance, that they will use the real estate of the university as a kind of profit mechanism, or the catering service, or the transport service, and that by the board of supervisors influence they have then a say about that. So it depends by country cases very much, but most of the private universities are on the for-profit sector.
Yeah. And I mean, the short answer to that is, I mean, Edward may want to say a little bit more, is we don't know what difference it does make. And Hans's characterization, again, based on not much research, is that most are for profit, and we just don't know how they compare with the rest.
Yeah. Okay, maybe some very short answer to the next question is, how about the quality assurance procedures for family-run universities? What are the possible challenges faced there? Can one of you say something? I think, again, it differs mostly by country, because how quality assurance regulations by government are established, but in general, and that is, of course, one of the differences that also Matt has expressed between a family business and a family university, which has to follow academic regulations, etc., is that most of the universities have to follow the quality assurance regulations of the academic institutions in the private sector in the country. So that defines very much how quality assurance procedures affect family-owned universities. But I don't know if
the requirements for family-owned universities are the same as for other private universities, and in quite a number of countries, the accreditation and quality assurance requirements for the public sector and the private sector vary, and that becomes an interesting political issue in those countries. But there's very little difference,
right,
from what I know, about what family-owned universities and other privates are supposed to do.
Right. Globally, and I just like to add, globally, the identity of family-owned institutions is not nuanced beyond having a private status, meaning that they are invariably part of the higher education system, and they are private institutions, and there is no distinction made from the perspective of the government.
Yeah. Okay, very last point. I can briefly, there's several other questions, and if one of the three of you has possibilities to answer that in the chat, that would be fine, because we have to move on. But one is, are there other types of private ownership or relationship of the private sector to besides the family-owned one? And of course, there are several of them, and we had limited to really family-owned and managed, because they're also, for instance, the Central European University, which is financed as a philanthropic enterprise by the Soros Foundation, which is a different type of influence. Then you have multinational companies or private companies that own universities, but are not family. So there are other types of universities owned by private owners than the families only. But our impression still is that the family-owned and family universities are the largest part of that whole conglomerate. And that is also because they are very much embedded in the local community to serve, to make a profit or to serve the local community in that context. Well, thank you all three for your presentations and the discussion. And thank you also for being active in the chat room. If you have time in the second part to also answer some of the questions that are still there, we will do, but I would suggest that we start now with the second part, and maybe Giorgio, do you want to take over here for me?
Yes, I can take over from you, Hans. Thank you very much. So we can move now to the second part of this interesting webinar, and we will have 4 interesting case studies from different parts of the world, from different regions of the world. And I think without further ado, we can start immediately from India, from Professor Vidya Yeravdekar, sorry for my bad pronunciation, from Symbiosis International Universities. Dr. Vidya, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Altbach and Hans for inviting me to speak at this webinar. And I'm glad that all 3 of you, Edward, Hans, and Philip, all of you have visited Symbiosis International University and actually seen what we do and how this is managed. So I'll just spend the next 8 minutes that you've given me into 3 parts. One, of course, the Indian higher education system. The second about the legal structure, and the Symbiosis case study in more specific terms. As we all know that the Indian higher education system is one of the largest higher education systems in the world. And the present statistics shows, the report has just come out from the Ministry of Education, and shows that we have 1,043 universities now and more than 50,000 colleges, which is large, and 38 million students in higher education sector. And therefore, if you see, the stakeholders are pretty large. I won't even count the number of academics that teach and the non-academic staff that is required, for this higher education sector. Now, out of the 1,000 plus universities, that there are about 396 private universities, which include both private as well as deemed to be universities. And of course, out of the colleges, more than 50,000 colleges, there are about more than 80% that are privately managed. So in our context, the privately managed or the privately owned institutions are in plenty. When Professor Altbach discussed with me about this topic, I think the name of the book was supposed to be, if I'm not mistaken, Privately Owned Higher Education Institutions. But I also requested him to use the word managed, because the legal structure in India doesn't allow a family or any one person to own a higher education institution. To clarify this further, there is a law by which you have to establish a society or a not-for-profit organization under a law, and then you can start a school or a college or a university. That's the way it functions in India, and therefore all higher education institutions as well as schools are not for profit in India, and therefore even Symbiosis International University is a not-for-profit organization. So there is this mother entity or a mother legal structure called Symbiosis in our case, which is called Symbiosis Society, and under it is one vertical, which is our schools, and the other vertical, which is the Symbiosis International University. And most of the privately managed institutions function in the same manner. You won't see, a private organization managing just a university, but generally, as Edward said, they would have schools as well as, higher education institutions. Because the demand is large in India. As I told you, the 38 million students just in higher education. You can imagine the numbers in school education. And therefore, and of course, the government cannot put in as much of funds and therefore the private sector has grown phenomenally. As regards the rankings in India or the accreditation, yes, privately managed higher education institutions are ranked. Just to give you a statistics of last year, amongst the top 50 universities, there were about 19 private universities that showed up in the National Institutional Ranking Framework of India. So, that means that, the quality is obviously accepted by the government. I would also say that initially in the earlier years, privately managed institutions were kind of discriminated. So students or even, the government, the policymakers, as well as academia felt that, private institutions are of low quality and, government or public institutions are of high quality. But that has changed because most of the private higher education institutions in India have professional programs running. So, whether it's medical schools, engineering schools, you see very few private institutions actually doing general programs like an arts and commerce program or, a liberal arts program. There would be more professional programs under private higher education institutions. The reasons are in plenty. Again, the demand is high. And second is, of course, the funding, because the kind of fees that you can charge for professional programs is definitely, you can charge much higher fees than general programs. Now, coming to the Symbiosis case study, and I'll also like to speak a little bit of financing, because that's the biggest challenge for privately managed higher education institutions across the world, I'm sure, is so it was started by Dr. Muzumdar, my father, 50 years ago, and I'm glad that this webinar is happening in this golden jubilee of Symbiosis International University. Now, so he was an educational entrepreneur, I would say, but a teacher who taught the subject of botany, biology in a college in Pune city, and noticing the problems of foreign students coming to study, in the city of Pune in different colleges, he realized that something needs to be done for these foreign students because they were discriminated. They came from Afro-Asian countries, primarily a large number from Africa, West Asia, and Southeast Asia. And there needed to be an organization for the welfare of these foreign students. So what I'm trying to stress is that this organization was formed out of benevolence, out of doing something for someone who needed help, and really not to establish an educational institution or a university. And so it began in our house, and I've actually grown up with Symbiosis. It's almost like a third sibling for me. And so from something to do with for foreign students, this organization was formed, and the founder felt that the best way to bring in international understanding between Indian and foreign students would be the medium of education. And that's how the first institution was started, which was teaching English to these foreign students who came from non-English speaking countries. And later, of course, it was almost one institution every year. And today, Symbiosis International University has more than 45,000 students spread across 5 cities in India. And of course, a large number of faculty members, non-teaching staff, and of course, A++ accredited and amongst the top 50 universities in India. But I think the evolution has been more on need-based courses, need-based programs, and of course, with government approvals, but nevertheless on student demand. And therefore, whenever there was a need for a program to be established, those programs got established. Many a times it was also out of the intuition of the founder. Just to give you an example, right now, just a year ago, we established the Symbiosis Medical College for Women, and all girls medical college, probably just the second in the country, and the first private medical school for girls in the country. Now, it was a very bold decision to establish this because, a medical school with a 900-bedded hospital, that is the requirement, with very, very stringent rules. For me, it was scary, but it was again out of intuition, and again because of something that he felt needs to be done for bringing in more girls into medical education, because India has just 17% girls who are practicing practicing doctors. And therefore, he felt, and of course, the financial resources and everything had to be gathered, and we put up the medical school. The point that I'm trying to make is the creator or the founder of a higher education institution, thinks of an idea. And, people like Edward, me, and others have to fulfill or realize that dream or that idea and bring that idea into reality. Now, the issue is of, someone asked the question of quality. Of course, that can be judged by, the accreditation and the rankings part, but I think the biggest challenge is to prove yourself, or prove in a country which is dominated by public institutions, to prove that the private higher education institution is also an institution of quality and an institution that can actually obviously provide employment, because that becomes a major driver for students to join a private higher education institution. It was also at one point in time to prove to the corporate world that yes, this is an institution that really creates good human resource for the corporate world. So it was a challenge in the initial parts, but now with the number of higher education institutions which are privately managed and who have proven their quality, I don't think this is a big challenge. For the second generation, like me and others, I think the challenge is also to keep up that quality, and not just keep up, but also be innovative in, trying to do things a little differently than what were done. And secondly, of course, that the world is watching you, or at least people in your city and country are watching you, and just trying to probably compare you with the founder, and, looking at, how you are going to run this institution. As I think Philip said, and the reason that Edward had been to Boston College, in India, I've not really seen private higher education institutions, second generation, really being sent for an academic program to, take over. In my own case, when I was studying, I don't think I ever had this, I never had this dream, nor did I ever think that I would, carry on the same legacy as what my father, created this for. I'm a medical doctor by training. And I used to practice obstetrics and gynecology. And so for several years, I was kind of out of the governance and the management of Symbiosis. But at a point in time when Symbiosis became a university by itself, initially it was affiliated to the state-funded university. When it became a university by itself, that's the time when I personally thought that I could offer some help. And that's the time when I actually began my professional association with Symbiosis 24 years ago. Initially to set up a healthcare center, being a doctor myself, and then later, of course, helping my father and the family to run, the Symbiosis. Again, in India, it's a little different, as I said, because it's not for profit.
Can you please try to conclude your intervention, because otherwise we are at risk to run over time with all the other case studies. Sorry to interrupt you.
Sure, thank you. So just give me 2 minutes. So the challenge here is, I think in any higher education institution that is privately managed, is funding. And so you have to manage the funds so well, because the revenues that come, to the private higher education institution is through the tuition fees. And therefore, to manage these funds well and to ensure growth and innovation in the same so-called business is one of the challenges. And therefore, I think the way you manage, at least to give our case study, we ensure a formula of 25, 50, 25. So, we spend 25% on salaries, 50% on educational expenses, and we keep 25% or maybe 20% as surplus. And we again don't call it profit, we call it surplus for the future development of the institution. So just to conclude, because of shortage of time, I would say that family owned or managed institutions, at least in this part of the world, have grown. One. The second is that they have shown that they do impart quality by the rankings and the accreditations that they get. And the third, of course, the challenges that were earlier seen are not as many as before. So the kind of discrimination between private and public and family managed and public institution that was seen very very overtly are not seen anymore. And fourth is that because they run professional courses, the revenues keep coming in, and if the revenues are managed well, I think it makes, as Matt said, a good business proposition. So I end here and I will be open to questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Vidya, for a very inspiring and interesting example from Symbiosis universities in India. And we now move to another part of the world. We go straight to Armenia, and I would like to give the floor to Arevik Onayan to present the case study of the Eurasia International Universities.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction, and hello from Armenia. Before I start, I would like to thank the distinguished professors for this initiative for the webinar. Very interesting webinar. Thank you very much. I will very briefly present the general statistics that we managed to gather about FOMHACE in Armenia, statistics of 2018, and afterwards I will briefly present the case study of Eurasian International University. Right after the collapse of Soviet Union and Armenia's transition to market economy, private educational entrepreneurship emerged in Armenia in all levels, pre-K, K-12, and tertiary levels. And already in 2098, public and private universities were operating, of which 82 were private universities. This is quite a large number for 3 million population in the country. The total student enrollment in the country was around 61,000 students, and out of which 35% were enrolled in private higher education system. Already in 2018, the number of private higher education institutions decreased drastically, and there were operating only 25 private institutions and serving only 12% of student cohort. As the above statistics indicate, the number of private higher education providers decreased more than 3 times in the country, from 82 to 25 since 2000, and the share of students enrolled in the private sector decreased by nearly half. Based on analysis and data collected for the study, 20 out of 25 private universities in Armenia are family-owned and family-managed universities. So most of them are FOMHEIs. I should note that for both private and state universities, the accreditation requirements are completely the same. There are no differences. And for both these institutions, there is a Center for Accreditation, which is called National Center for Professional Education Quality Assurance Foundation, ANCA. And as 2018, only 3 private higher education institutions were accredited by ANCA, only 3. And all 3 institutions were family-owned and managed universities. And one of the survivors was Eurasian International University. In most of the FOMHEIs, with only several exceptions, there are observable patterns in their governance and decision-making in general. And interviews and document analysis carried out for this research indicate that power and authority are often centralized among the institutional leadership and the rector, who often is a founding family member. He's involved in handling even minor non-strategic issues. Most financial decisions are often made by directors solely or in consultancy with founding family members. As of 2018, based on the analysis again carried out for this study, 12 out of 20 FOMHEIs in Armenia were still headed by their founders. The average number of years of service as a rector in these 12 cases was 24 years. After on average 18 years of leadership, 8 universities transitioned into the second generation and have changed their rectors. In all these cases, the successors were immediate members and continue the family tradition of a little bit centralized management, centralized decision-making, lack of consultation with the board and other stakeholders of the university, lack of strategic planning, among others. In all cases, the successors were mostly automatic. The successions were mostly automatic and not based on a concrete succession plan or any competition. As to the case study of Eurasian International University, the history of EIU began in leased facilities. It was founded in 1996-7. And in 2005, the family decided to sell their residence in central Yerevan in order to finance a down payment on a more permanent building in a suburb of the city. Subsequent loans and grants allowed the family to purchase, expand, and renovate facility, and the university ultimately moved to its own building, where presently it is headquartered and operates. As you see, the building of the university used to be a relay factory during the Soviet time, and the university owners had to transform the environment, facilities, and infrastructure to the requirements and needs of the university. This period was not only transformational in terms of building, but also in terms of management for the university. A major self-assessment in 2009 concluded that Eurasia International University operations were highly dependent on individual subjective decisions made either by founding family member or by key personnel working at the university for more than 10 years. Although certain operational regulations did exist on paper, they were often not observed and implemented in practice. So key processes were poorly regulated, and this included financial control and budgeting, purchasing, human resource recruitment, evaluation, etc. Within the revised charter of Eurasia International University, the functions and the scope of strategic decision-making by the rector and the board of founders are quite reduced. During the systemic revision, the management board, comprising the university's academic and administrative staff, students, alumni, and employers, were empowered to review and approve the university's structure, strategy, annual and long-term budgets, define the tuition fees, etc. The rector's annual plan and report and their correspondence with the approved strategic plan are now regulated by management boards. Again, not by board of founders, but by management board, which is completely different. In parallel, the functions of board of founders, the family, have been reduced to the decisions on university real estate matters only. The vision of the current EIU leadership is that the reduced role of board of founders and the strengthened role of various management committees and bodies will enhance participatory decision-making at Eurasia and create a solid basis for the smooth transition and succession of management to new leaders with no personal and familiar connections to the founding family. So we think that the FOMHACE should, in Armenia, should rethink the common practice of automatic familiar succession and have clear succession planning and be open to professional merit-based management, particularly in cases when technical expertise is lacking within the funding family. So this was a very short presentation, and I will be more than happy to answer to your questions. Also, being a family member, as you say from the surname, the university was founded by my father also, Mr. Juan, who used to work in state systems, state higher education institutions, leading different departments, and afterwards decided to start a private path and entrepreneurship in private sector. So I will be more than happy to answer your questions. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Dr. Olayan, for a very interesting case study of Eurasia International Universities. And now it's now time to move back to South Korea and back again to Edward Choi, this time with a different hat. And he will speak about the case study of Beyonce University. Edward, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Not the case study of Beyonce University. My chapter is more of a national overview, an overview of the character of Famis and the state of Famis in Korea. Okay, so before I talk about the character of Famis in Korea and the state of this special class of institutions in Korea, I will provide a brief introduction of the Korean higher education system. In terms of institutional count and types, there are currently 429 higher education institutions as of 2020. Around 190 universities, around 140 junior colleges and other types. Other types include cyber universities, industrial universities, polytechnics, etc. For a full listing, you can visit this link here. Over 80% are found in the private sector. Private institutions are nonprofit by law, and also the rest are national institutions operated by federal level bodies such as the Ministry of Education, and public institutions operated by municipalities, local municipalities. In terms of enrollment, there are 3.3 million students enrolled. The gross, the GER is over 90%. 80%, the vast majority of institutions capture are private in status and capture the majority of enrollment, around 80%. And here are some other statistics relating to enrollment. In terms of external governance, Korea is a case in which government oversight is quite stringent. Status controls may be found in most university affairs, including budget development, admissions, curriculum, tuition, so on and so forth. Over the years, beginning in 2003, the government started to carry out these what are called audit-based restructuring projects. And these are designed to raise the competitiveness and the quality of Korea's higher education system. And in part, they are designed to reduce higher education supply to meet the falling demand. Korea faces a demographic cliff right now due to the world's lowest fertility rate, I think as of this year or last year. All right, so that's some background information of Korea's higher education system. FAMIs, the modern version of FAMIs first appeared in the 1940s when Korea enacted the Agricultural Land Act, allowing the government to expropriate private land for public use. And it was at that time that farmers and other landowners rushed to establish institutions on their land so they can keep the land. Since then, FAMIs began to grow in numbers, especially during the years leading up to and during Korea's massification period. And it was during this time when the government allowed or encouraged the participation of private actors in higher education delivery. It's difficult to estimate accurately the number of FAMIs operating in Korea, but according to some research, I believe there are upwards of 200 FAMIs operating in Korea. Many of these FAMIs are four-year universities. Many of them are some of them are cyber universities, and most, if not all, junior colleges are family-based. In terms of ownership structure, universities are founded by first establishing a nonprofit educational foundation. The institution becomes part of this foundation, and more or less, the institution is supervised by this foundation, by the board situated within the nonprofit educational foundation. And it's common in Korea to have situations where multiple institutions are tied to a single educational foundation. Thus, family members who sit on the board of these educational foundations, they are understood to manage or own the universities and colleges and secondary schools and so on and so forth tied to the educational foundation. Now, the governance structure at FAMIs in Korea is centralized, with the foundation board operating as the highest decision-making body. And in the case in which there are multiple institutions, there is a single board supervising multiple institutions. And this creates opportunities and challenges that I wanted to talk about before, but I believe I was running out of time. One challenge relates to having centralized governance structures invariably suppresses democratic decision-making processes. And this could be a problem in higher education. As we all know, democratic governance modalities is an imperative in higher education. And when it's time to transfer control, the foundation board votes to either appoint family members to leadership positions within the board and or within positions in the organizational hierarchy, position as president, so on and so forth. So the foundation board plays a significant role in facilitating the transfer of power from older generations to younger generation family members. In Korean higher education institutions, democratic modalities and bodies do exist in the form of academic senates, committees, processes that bring together faculty and leaders. So elements of horizontal governance do exist. So indeed, they exist, but while faculty can sway decision-making through these governance structures, most of the time, the interests and values of the family prevail. So the dominant family coalition has significant power in swaying the decisions made at the university, especially in cases where a family member is the university president. The family member has considerable power within the organizational hierarchy and has sway in the board as well, as cases that the president will also be a board member. However, in Korea, and I believe Phil started talking about this before, earlier, In Korea, you cannot have arrangements where family members occupy multiple leadership positions. For example, you cannot have a situation where a family member is the chair of the board as well as the president. So the family member can be a board member, but he or she cannot be the chair, cannot occupy the chair position. Also, a single family member may not control the position of president in a university and another leadership position in a different organization tied to the same foundation. Also, 1/4 of board members have to be chosen from a recommended list provided by an open committee that does not include family members and other board members. And also there's an auditor appointed to monitor operations and accounting at these board meetings. The auditor may not be a family member. So there are federal level measures to limit familial influence. Now, families may face many challenges. One challenge I mentioned before about having centralized governance structures. These are some of the other challenges. Most families have a periphery status in Korea, meaning that they are lower tier and don't have the reputational cash to attract both domestic and international students. This is connected to the reality that most families are located provincially. So there's a regional disadvantage. The shape of demand in Korea is one-sided and in the direction of major cities. So these institutions do not have deep student recruitment pools, situation which has become dire in recent years as the nation faces a demographic cliff. There simply aren't enough students to go around. In Korea, it's common knowledge that many universities and colleges are owned by families in Korea. This has been a source of significant controversy because there are families that make the news for embezzling money or being involved in other scandals. Thus, there is a negative public perception of families, and this in part is the reason why government scrutiny is so high in the private sector. Public distrust regarding the private sector, not just in higher education, but across all industries, is quite strong in Korea. The high government scrutiny is another challenge. I'm not sure if my colleague Matt talked about this, but centralized decision-making also creates an opportunity where decision-making becomes quite efficient, and family-based organizations are understood to make decisions quickly, and they're in a position to react readily to market shifts. In the case of Korea, this might not be an advantage. This advantage may not exist for family-owned institutions because of the high government scrutiny. There's a lot of red tape, a lot of bureaucratic processes and approvals that the family-owned institution has to satisfy and go through. There are also funding challenges as the base of college students shrink. Families are already facing the problem of falling demand and therefore shortfalls in the budget. Most families primarily, as with most private institutions, I believe, primarily rely on cost-cutting solutions to compensate for shortfalls in the budget. The exception are, of course, a few families based in major cities in Korea and families that have been founded by wealthy families that may inject fresh funding into the university when facing budgetary crisis. Finally, the succession process at families is challenging and rife with tension. Rarely is this succession process uneventful. Successors are held to incredibly high standards and often compared with the founder and other family members before them. And it's often the case that people loyal to the founder, loyalty lines do not extend to family successors in most cases. So there is resistance coming both from non-family stakeholders and as well as family stakeholders, so family members having entitlement beliefs who believe that they are more entitled for the position of leadership. So there is significant tension surrounding this family-based succession process. Despite the challenges that I just talked about, families in Korea are a permanent fixture. They are found in significant numbers in Korea, and it is reasonable to conclude that they have performed an important function in society in educating a significant segment of Korea's population. They have contributed to the creation of Korea's knowledge-based workforce, with over 70% of 25 to 35-year-olds having some form of a tertiary degree. And many families are impactful in their local communities. Many families are operated by families families with strong educational convictions to affect positive change and are highly regarded by members of the local community. And it's unfortunate that these narratives are lost because of a handful of corrupt families. However, this role that families have, Phil mentioned this as well, most families have a demand absorbing role. And in Korea, certainly this was the case in the history of Korea. This role is now being called into question because of ongoing and changing circumstances. For example, falling higher education demand, quality issues. So families not performing according to government standards, according to the restructuring-based audit-based schemes that I talked about earlier, and of course, corruption. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Choi, for a very comprehensive overview of family-owned and managed higher education institution in Korea. And now, last but not least, please let's welcome Juan and Tamra, president of St. Mary University, to speak about the case of his own university in Ethiopia. Professor Tamra, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'll actually be talking about the national profile of family-owned or managed higher education institutions. Mine was a national survey that included 133 private higher education institutions in Ethiopia. A survey questionnaire was administered to them. It also included an interviews I held with owners of private higher education institutions, family-owned, and leaders of the National Quality Assurance Agency. My research was actually guided by two major questions, which were raised by previous speakers. The first question I tried to answer was, my purpose was understanding the operational features and the peculiar nature of the family-owned or managed higher education institutions. And the second one was this conceptual or practical challenges of family managed or owned institutions, especially in terms of their legitimacy and continuity. So I was guided by these two purposes, and what I found out, I'll very quickly relate. But to give you a very brief background of the Ethiopian higher education system, ours is 70 years old. It's a public dominated system. Currently, we have like 50 public universities, but more than 300 private higher education institutions, which includes 5 full-fledged universities. But in terms of enrollment, still it's a public dominated system whereby you have 85% of enrollment among the 1 million students goes to the public sector. Now, private higher education is a new phenomenon. It actually started in 1998 with the establishment of the first private college in the country. And it was driven by government policies and the increasing demand among the population for higher education enrollment, because the public system was highly limited in terms of addressing the issue of access. Now, when government started, or rather initiated, private higher education in the country, you might call it was a more organized move on the part of the government, and they had to enact a new policy, quite contrary to the previous system, which banned any form of private ownership. Government enacted a new policy whereby different forms of ownership were allowed without any restriction, actually. So that brought different types of institutions, and that has given us in 2 decades more than 300 private higher education institutions, as I said. If we look at the different features and peculiar nature of the institutions, the first peculiar nature that you see in Ethiopia, quite different from what you have at continental level, is the fact that the Ethiopian higher education ecosystem is dominated by for-profit private higher education institutions. Essentially, they dominate the whole system. And the form of ownership that's encouraged in Ethiopia has no restrictions, as I said. Now, from my findings, what I found out was that there are two major forms of ownership, what I would call profit-oriented ownership, which divides again into what we call sole proprietorship, whereby a single individual can own a university or a higher education institution, or a PLC, which is more like into what we've been talking about, a family-owned institution, where a limited number of family members could set up an institution. And we have also what we call a shareholding, which in other parts of the world, it is more like a corporate form of ownership, where you have, beyond 50, about 50 owners involved. It could go also in thousands. This is for the profit sector, but we have also a system whereby non-profits also exist, where corporations, organizations, NGOs could be involved in owning a system. According to my findings, as I said, the private limited companies or the family-owned institutions dominate the sector, and 91% of the existing institutions go into this. With regard to the shareholding, it's still profit-oriented. We have 3.7%, but the non-profits, which are set up by religious organizations, NGOs, any form of NGOs, corporations, those only hold 5% of the total number of institutions that we have. Now, in terms of the size and the program focus, most of the previous speakers, most of the previous speakers said, works in the Ethiopian context as well. But I would also like to say that there are semi-elite institutions, very limited in numbers, with research orientations, and additionally with high level of quality comparable to the public sector that exists in Ethiopia. But these are quite limited in number. Most of the family-owned or managed higher education institutions exist in the capital. Around 50% of them still exist in the capital, but this is changing as the competition is getting bigger and higher. Most focus on undergraduate programs, but still there are some which are moving into postgraduate programs. The capital outlay, I have found this to be in hundreds of millions of USDs. Funding is totally tuition-based, based on what the institutions earn from individual students. But in terms of motivation, there are two major areas which are, suggested by stakeholders as to be the driving forces for these institutions to mushroom in this rate of existence. One is said to be genuine social motive. The next one is is said to be commercial. Now, the most interesting part of the story is if you ask the institution holders about their motivations, they would always tell you that it's genuine. But if you look at other stakeholders, the quality assurance agency leaders and other stakeholders, they would pronounce that it's mostly the commercial interest that drives many of these owners who would come into the field. Actually, then the type of owners that we have are completely different from what has been suggested. You could have university professors, nurses, you could have entrepreneurs, you could have simple business people who thought that this new area is lucrative and who are there. So you have a mix of different types of owners, which makes, as has been said, very difficult to characterize the whole nature of the family-owned or managed higher education institutions. In terms of governance and accountability, which quite relates with the motivations, you would see that by law, the family-owned or managed higher education institutions are accountable both to the government in terms of academic operations and performance, and accountable to their owners as well in terms of their business, in terms of the financial performance as well. But what we see in terms of who owns these family-owned private higher education institutions, as I said, they are dominated by families. But again, if you look at the actual involvement of family members, since the law does not restrict where they should go and how or what roles they should assume, what I have found out is that 70% of the institutional owners have direct involvement in the governance of the institutions. You call it at board level, you call it at CEO level, you call it at president or dean level, they are always there. And they have also additional members who assume different key positions, like financial positions within the framework of the governance of the institution. And this has brought both, as has been said by Edward, both challenges and opportunities. Now, generally, in terms of what I have found out, as regards to my second objective, the conceptual or practical challenges of family managed higher education institutions, there are controversial views. There are people who would look at the positive side and say that if family managed or owned institutions are promoted with the way they are now, they can bring into the sector innovation, the possibility of taking risks, decision making with little red tape, healthy working environment. But this only happens, many think, under the circumstances where owners are ready to subscribe their internal interests, financial interests, into what is broadly identified as institutional regulations and effective operations. Most feel that, especially the external stakeholders, feel that if these institutions are in the hands of profit-driven owners, there are lots of challenges related to the involvement of family members with no qualification, with no experience, owners meddling in every affair of the institution, lack of participatory governance, as Edward was citing, the lack of collective action making, and power concentrating in very few hands. I know that ours is a little bit different from what Edward and the professor from Symbiosis talked about. The higher education institutions, the family-owned higher education institutions in Ethiopia are only in their first generation. It's only in the last 20 years that we have them here. But one thing that we for sure have noted is that the very existence of these institutions and the way that they operate is complicated by the additional layer of family relationships that comes into every respect, every part of their operation. So there are these questions on both sides by both owners, genuine owners who would accept the challenges of having this form of ownership, and especially stakeholders and regulatory bodies would keep on asking that should we leave family owned or managed higher education institutions to the individual, assuming that they would find a way in which they will make them legible and acceptable in terms of operations and in terms of perceptions. There are also people who would ask that should we rather dictate a form of ownership, for instance, a shareholder form of ownership, where there is a lot of involvement in terms of owners, rather than a limited number of families, would provide additional opportunities to control how the institution is operating. Or the third alternative, the third question that's usually asked it, or should there be a regulatory requirement? Not as strict as what Edward was suggesting, but not as lax as what exists now, so that we ensure the sustainability and legitimacy of these questions. I think the next decade or two would decide whether we would be able to respond to these questions, to provide satisfactory answers to these questions, and ensure the sustainability of these forms of private higher education institutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Tamra. Thank you very much. And first of all, I would like to apologize in a way because we are running out of time. So actually, we're already 2 minutes past our time, but it would be a pity not to have at least one round for questions and also having a closure of the webinar. So if you agree, I kindly ask all participants if they can stay something like 10 minutes more so that we can ask just one quick question to all the 4 panelists, the same question to all, and then we can conclude the webinar. So the question I would like to ask, it's a mixture of all the questions that we receive in the chat. We don't have time for that, but some of them were touching more or less a same type of question, which is the following one. So the question is, are there any specific features of family-owned and managed higher education universities that are really specific to them? For instance, if they attract a particular student population, if they have a specific employment rate, if they are able to attract a specific type of professors and researchers, or if they're subjected to some specific accreditation. So can you please, starting with the same order of your presentation, so starting from Dr. Vidya, just in one sentence, indicate if there exists a specific characteristic of family-owned and managed higher education institution in your country, or if it does not exist, if they're the same as other private institutions, please just say that. Thank you very much. So please, Dr. Vidya, the floor is yours.
So I don't think it is very specific, but I can just say that family-owned institutions, as I said, are more teaching universities or higher education institutions. Now, of course, moving on to research. And the second is that, they are more accountable to students. And the third is that they generate employment much more than, I would say, public institutions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Vidya. Very clear and very brief also. Dr. Oayan, please.
Yes, in case of Armenia, originally the private institutions and FOMPAs were serving the student cohorts that did not manage to enter state universities. But during the recent years, due to demographic decline, the state universities also open up their doors, and also due to increased competition from international and intergovernmental universities. So both private and state universities currently are trying to attract students with high merit. And in case of our university, for instance, introducing scholarship schemes and various targeted efforts, we managed to attract high quality and students during the recent years. So this is also changing, and the country, both on the state level and also the employers, are learning to live with private sector, because during the Soviet time, this was not existing. So the country is learning to live with private system, and during the recent years, the employment rate has also increased in private educational establishment, because we're teaching oriented and we are filling the gap of skills in many cases not developed in larger universities. So private universities mostly are concentrated on developing practical skills of students. Based on that, the employment rate in many cases is quite high.
Thank you, Dr. Honayan. So now, Dr. Choi, can you please also tell us what do you think about any specificity of family-owned and managed universities?
Sure, that's a great question. I can speak to the Korean case. Unique traits, I would say, relate to the socio-emotional wealth that I discussed earlier. So renewal, family-based succession, family influence, emotional attachments, especially renewal, family-based succession. A family owned or managed institution would cease to be a family owned or managed institution if there wasn't a family-based succession process at institution. That is a unique trait of the FAME landscape. So, and also, I think there is something unique about families in that family-based leadership, they make decisions in relation to the risk of losing socio-emotional wealth. So they make decisions in relation to accumulating socio-emotional wealth. And in certain cases, this is more important than any financial incentive.
Thank you very much. And now, Professor Tamra, can you also conclude this round of questions with your opinion on a specific feature of family-owned and managed universities?
In our case, what I would like to suggest is that most family-owned and managed higher education institutions typically share the characteristic of private higher education institutions, as Phil said, and what we see in Ethiopia is that they are quite known, very much known for their gender representation. We have like more than 50% of our students female, which is not characteristic of the public sector, which has a rate of like 30 to 35% of their enrollment rate. The second one is what makes peculiar the nature of such institutions, their efficiency and output, efficiency in terms of resource utilization, and efficiency in terms of output, specifically as related to graduate employability. I think those characteristics could identify Ethiopian family-owned or managed higher education institutions from the public and other types of institutions here.
Thank you very much, Professor Tamrat, and thank you to all speakers for their very interesting presentation and also for being very brief in this round of question and answer. And now I would like to give the floor back to Gerardo Enilige for the last words and to conclude this interesting webinar. Gerardo Enilige, the floor is yours. Thank you very much to everybody.
I will just take a second to thank all of our facilitators and our presenters. I also want to thank the International Association of Universities for their partnership with us, and just to say that we really look forward to continuing in the fall with our webinar series. Thank you to all of you who have participated over the last year of innovation and adaptation to COVID times.
I can only echo your words, Gerardo. Very nice to be partnering with CIHE from Boston College and to do this together, even though this work is really a very warm applause to the work done by the CIHE and this research that calls for more research in the future as well. Prior to the session, we discussed this with Hans de Witt as well, where we said, do we actually know how many of these universities are family owned? And that is something, as many of the speakers and also the case studies revealed, is something that is not always visible when it comes to mapping higher education. And so the role that all your universities play in the development of quality higher education is essential, and it will be very important to continue the conversations in the future. I've learned a lot, and I guess the participants as well. And as Phil said in the beginning, this is one of the highlights of the webinar series, also together with excellent food for thought and a wish to continue our conversations in the future. At the IAU as well, we have this joint series of webinars. We also have the IAU webinar series on the future of higher education. We still have a few to come up until mid-July, but then we will break as well, and we will continue and resume in the fall, and hopefully also together with CIHE, because we see this as very nice and an opportunity for further engagement in thinking about how best to develop higher education in the future. So a very warm thank you to all the excellent speakers and for the work shared. And I enjoyed reading the book a lot, and I hope others will do the same. So thank you so much, and have a good day, evening, or eve or night for those, depending on where you are around the world. Thank you.
May I clarify a point? The speaker, when introducing me, talked about Yonsei University. I'd like to note that Yonsei University is not affiliated to my university in no way. All right, so I just want to clarify that point. I teach at Yonsei University. Yonsei University is not a family-owned institution that I'm affiliated with.
That's fine.
Very good. So there is much more to be clarified, probably in the future, because there are many more questions that will come. Very good.
Okay, well, thank you everybody for being here. And again, we hope to continue having you in future joint webinars or webinars of IAU or webinars CIHE or many other ones.